Over the course of the January 6th investigation, we've learned a lot of new and quite frankly disturbing information about just how close we came to losing American democracy. But now we're getting a look at the efforts of sitting United States Senator Mike Lee and a congressman and what they did to help the former guy before eventually souring on their efforts. Text messages first reported by CNN show exchanges between then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, Senator Mike Lee, and Congressman Chip Roy in the weeks between the 2020 election and the attack on the Capitol. In a series of texts to Meadows on November the 7th, Lee offered his, quote, unequivocal support for you to exhaust every legal and constitutional remedy when it comes to the 2020 election. Lee then goes on to offer some words of encouragement to Trump, telling him to, quote, stay strong and keep fighting. And ultimately, Lee and Roy were not part of the 147 Republicans who voted to overturn the election results, a fact Lee's spokesperson pointed out in a statement, saying, quote, the text messages tell the same story Senator Lee told from the floor of the Senate the day he voted to certify the election results of each and every state in the nation. Joining me now is Maya Wiley. She's an MSNBC legal analyst and incoming president of Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Also, David Jolly, former congressman and national chairman of the Serve America movement. David, this op-ed in the Washington Post about Senator Lee's text messages stuck out to me. It said, quote, so a Republican senator, a self-proclaimed constitutional conservative, no less, misled the country about his participation in a plot to overturn a presidential election. And yet, not one of the 5 major Sunday talk shows mentioned one word about Senator Lee and his involvement here. Speak to the urgency of this particular issue. How big of a deal is it that sitting representatives on the Republican side were a part of this effort potentially? Do we need to focus on this more?
I think so, Zerlina, because I think it shows the frame of mind of a sitting U.S. senator and likely colleagues and others on the day after the election, when his immediate posture was, I don't like the way this is going, so I'm going to lend my help to the White House to overturn the election. That was his frame of mind. That was his forethought. And it was not until, honestly, he got too close to the crazy that he decided to step back. And then he started to say, I don't like the direction this is going. Well, he had 4 years to get to understand the crazy that was Donald Trump. And as that crazy was translated to this anti-democratic authoritarian approach to government, and Mike Lee was happy to embrace that until he got too close to the fire. Look, Mike Lee is in cycle for re-election. And I think the people of Utah should demand a lot of answers for him. That is a deep red state. The Democrats are not often competitive. There is an independent in the Senate race. So a 3-way race might dilute the field and make it stronger for Mike Lee, or it might give conservative people in Utah an alternative to their traditional Republican nominee, in this case, Mike Lee.
I mean, Maya, when you read these messages between Senator Lee and Mark Meadows, I mean, what do you see in them? Do you see them planning a coup? Do you see them trying to overturn an American election? What do you think they're evidence of, and how do they fit into this larger story and the other things we already know?
You know, first of all, it's quite clear and explicit that they're trying to overthrow the election. What's interesting to me about it is 2 things. In the beginning, in November, Senator Lee, they seem to be buying the big lie, right? That voter fraud was rampant and that there's evidence of voter fraud. And that's when, Mike Lee is sidling up to Sydney Crazy, I'm blanking on her last name, who is pushing this legal theory around the voter fraud, except it doesn't take him very long before he realizes there's not any evidence. And yet, by the end of November, he knows there's no evidence. He starts pulling away from Sidney Powell, but yet he's all on top of the fake electors strategy. And it's very interesting, I mean, because he's sort of laying out, oh, well, let's follow state law and let the state legislators impanel these fake electors. And it's a little concerning that he thinks that this is lawful, particularly as a constitutionalist, a conservative constitutionalist. But it's also one of those things that makes you wonder why, even though he goes and backs off of that position by the time the election has to be certified, recognizes that there's no legal claim to impanel the fake electors, that he still votes against impeachment. He votes against it even as he himself has done the research and understood there were simply no grounds.
I mean, he's defending his action, saying he voted to certify, but you're right to point out he voted against impeachment, which was the case about all the things that led up to the insurrection, which I think is something you can't ignore. It's not like you skip over that as if it's not relevant to the larger story about the effort to overturn the election. And David, what are the dangers of having someone who attempted to overturn an American election in the federal government, setting federal policy for the rest of us? I mean, is that inherently dangerous to the health of our democracy?
It is, because Mike Lee actually behaved in exactly the same way Donald Trump did, which is Mike Lee, in particular, given his training and knowledge, knows in this environment he has no jurisdiction. What Mike Lee knows is that he has the ability to vote yes or no to certify the results that have been submitted by the states. It is not up to the United States Senate to decide how a Secretary of State from the state of Georgia or Florida or anywhere else counts those votes or roots out fraud. And yet, Mike Lee, knowing he has no jurisdiction, has decided to wade into this. That is the danger, and that is what Trumpism brought into the Republican Party, that the ends justify the means and that there is no constitutional prescriptions or restrictions on the behavior of elected officials. That is the danger.
And Maya, we now know that basically most of the folks around Trump at the time knew of all of the efforts to try to install fake electors, all of the efforts to try in the courts to overturn the election result. I mean, do these messages fit into the evidentiary pile in terms of Donald Trump's individual culpability and potential criminality here? Do you think that all of these text messages basically tell us that the president knew exactly what all these other people were doing?
Well, look, we certainly know from these text messages that the president was being briefed on all these points, right? So Mike Lee is saying to Mark Meadows, hey, where's the evidence? Like, I think we have to move away from Sidney Powell and focus on fake electors. And it's clear as in Mark Meadows' response that he apparently is communicating to the president about these things, right? No surprise there. He's the chief of staff. But something else is this other little nugget that we should focus on, which is that at one point, Mark Meadows himself, in this text exchange, makes clear that he knows that Vice President Pence, or at least it appears from the text, does not have the power to overturn this election. He says that it's a problem that Donald Trump thinks that Pence does, and that's evident.
Ongoing saga of American democracy. Maya Wiley and David Jolly, thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe. Hi, I'm Zerlina Maxwell. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more from Zerlina by clicking any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thanks for watching.